It was a Monday morning that began with the mundane rhythm of a life I thought was built on granite, but which was, in reality, constructed entirely of glass. I was 42, a mechanical engineer with a steady paycheck, a beautiful suburban home, and a wife of 17 years, Kayla, whose career as an accountant provided the perfect polish to our suburban American dream. We had two teenagers, Josh and Carly, who were smart, athletic, and the pride of our lives. I believed, with the naive, unshakable confidence of a man who has never looked behind the curtain, that we were the definition of a stable, happy family. I had no way of knowing that the very foundation of my existence was about to be obliterated not by a grand, cinematic event, but by a physical sensation so agonizing it would force me to confront the reality of my wife's secret life. A reality that would end, quite unexpectedly, with her losing everything while I reclaimed my own sense of peace. The morning started like every other. I kissed Kayla on the cheek as she checked her emails, ignoring the slight dismissive tightness of her smile and the way she held her phone close to her chest. She was a master of her routine, the accountant persona that was all business, all precision, all lies. I left for the office at 7:45 a.m., my mind focused on a stack of end-of-the-month engineering reports. I grabbed a coffee, settled into my cubicle, and was just about to dive into the technical details of a new project when a sharp, searing pain erupted in my body, centering on my lower abdomen. It wasn't a dull ache or a stomach cramp. It was a visceral, white-hot burning sensation that felt as if someone had taken a razor blade to my insides. I stood up, gasping for air, clutching the edge of my desk as the world blurred around the edges. My supervisor, Alan, walked by just then, noticed the gray pallor of my skin, and stopped in his tracks. "Thomas, are you okay? You look like you're about to pass out," Alan asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. I couldn't even speak. The pain was absolute. I managed to murmur that I needed to step into the restroom, but the physical sensation was overwhelming. It was only 8:45 a.m., and yet as I stumbled toward the restroom, I felt like my body was failing me in the most humiliating public way possible. I collapsed into a stall, gasping, shaking, and utterly confused by the intensity of the trauma. When I looked down, the reality of my situation hit me with a force that stripped away every bit of my previous certainty. It was a discharge, an undeniable greenish symptom that screamed a truth so loud I didn't need a medical degree to understand what it meant. My first feeling wasn't even anger. It was an overwhelming, soul-crushing disgust. It was the physical manifestation of my wife's betrayal. I don't remember how I got out of that office. I remember Alan helping me back to my car, his face filled with pity, and me telling him I had a sudden medical emergency. I drove to the nearest urgent care clinic, my hands white-knuckling the steering wheel, every bump in the road feeling like a physical assault. The waiting room was filled with the usual suspects: parents with coughing kids, workers with minor injuries, people just trying to get through their Monday. I sat in a plastic chair, staring at the wall, feeling like a ghost. I was a man who had been faithful for 17 years, a man who had dedicated his life to his family, and here I was, waiting to be diagnosed with an infection that only one person could have given me. The nurse who eventually called my name looked at my chart, then at me, and her expression flickered with an uncomfortable, pitying curiosity. She took my vitals, left me in an exam room, and when the doctor finally walked in, the air in the room seemed to vanish. He was a middle-aged man with a weary look, a man who had delivered this news 1,000 times before. He looked at the test results, then up at me, and didn't mince words. "You have gonorrhea, Thomas," he said, his voice flat. The silence that followed was absolute. It felt as if time had folded in on itself. I asked him, my voice barely a whisper, if he was absolutely sure, and he just nodded, offering a pamphlet on antibiotics. He told me the usual things: how to take the medication, what to avoid, and the standard advice to inform my partner immediately so she could be tested as well. He didn't know. He couldn't know that my partner was the one who had brought this into our home. As I sat there listening to his clinical, detached instructions, I felt the 17 years of my life, the mortgage, the soccer practices, the grocery shopping, the anniversaries, dissolve. Kayla wasn't just working late hours as an accountant. She wasn't just stressed about tax season. She was living a life I had absolutely no part in, and the price of that discovery was a burning physical shame that would soon be eclipsed by a cold, hard rage. I walked out of that clinic, the prescription in my pocket, realizing that the man who had walked in that morning was dead. A new, much colder man was about to take his place. The drive from the urgent care clinic to my parents' house was a blur of gray asphalt and shattered nerves. I had spent 17 years believing I was the lead actor in a perfectly written, stable drama, only to have the script ripped to shreds in 30 minutes. My hands shook so violently on the steering wheel that I had to pull over for a moment, just to keep from driving off the road. Every memory of the last 2 decades, the birthday parties for Josh and Carly, the mortgage payments, the quiet evenings watching television on the couch was being recontextualized in real time, stained by the undeniable reality of Kayla's betrayal. I reached my parents' house, and the moment my father opened the door, he didn't even need to ask. He saw the hollowed-out look in my eyes and the way I was clutching the prescription bag as if it were a grenade. He just stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. I sat at their kitchen table, the same one where I had learned my multiplication tables as a child, and I spilled everything. I didn't hold back the medical details, the diagnosis, or the agonizing realization that the person I had shared a bed with for nearly 2 decades was a stranger. My father, a man of few words but immense resolve, listened until I was finished. When I stopped speaking, the room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. My mother was weeping silently into a dish towel, but my father just sat there, his face hardening into a mask of pure, determined protection. He didn't offer any platitudes about working it out or forgiving for the sake of the children. He was a man who understood the finality of what I had just described. "You aren't going to do anything impulsive, Thomas," he said, his voice level and steady. "You are not going to storm into her office and make a scene. You are not going to give her the satisfaction of seeing you lose your cool. If she's been living a life behind your back for this long, she's been playing a game you didn't even know existed. You need to stop playing by her rules and start playing by your own." He was right. The rage that had been boiling in my chest was the kind of fire that destroys the person holding it. If I went into this blind, emotional, and reactive, I would lose. Sarah, no, Kayla, was an accountant, a woman who lived for precision, strategy, and double-entry bookkeeping. She knew how to balance the books. If I wanted to reclaim my life, I couldn't just win an argument. I had to dismantle her ability to manipulate the narrative. I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting on my parents' patio, looking out at their garden and trying to build a plan from the wreckage. I realized then that my marriage had been a long-term audition. I had been auditioning to be the provider, the good husband, the one who kept the home and the family running smoothly so she could have the freedom to do whatever she wanted on her own schedule. The free babysitter wasn't just a title she'd given me. It was the role I had been cast in without ever reading the script. That evening, when I knew Kayla would still be at the office, likely engaged in some late-night audit that was actually an afternoon rendezvous, I drove back home. The house felt like a tomb. It wasn't the home of a family, it was a museum of her staged perfection. I went straight to her home office. She kept her files in a heavy oak filing cabinet that was almost always locked. I had respected her privacy for 17 years, viewing her business files as sacred ground. But privacy is a luxury afforded to people who don't betray the bedrock of their household. I didn't have the key and I didn't care. I went to the garage, retrieved a heavy-duty flathead screwdriver and a mallet, and returned to the office. I didn't feel guilty. I felt a surge of clarity. I drove the screwdriver into the lock, gave it a hard whack with the mallet, and the mechanism gave way with a sharp, metallic crack. I pulled the drawers open, expecting to find accounting contracts and real estate invoices. Instead, I found a stack of documents from a bank I didn't recognize. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of my trust, and started turning the pages. The deeper I went into the folder, the colder I became. It wasn't just an affair. It was a masterpiece of financial deception. Kayla hadn't just been cheating on me, she had been systematically stripping away the wealth we had built together. She had diverted her quarterly bonuses, her performance commissions, and even tax refund checks into this secondary, untraceable account for over 8 years. The total, when I finally added up the final column, was agonizingly close to $1 million. I stood there in the quiet of her office, the weight of the paper in my hands feeling like lead. I had been the one making sure the bills were paid, the one who cut corners to save for the kids' college, the one who felt the tightness in my chest when money was tight. All the while, she was building an exit strategy. She wasn't just planning to leave, she was planning to leave me with the debt, the kids, and the responsibility, while she vanished into a life she had curated with my own blood and sweat. The disgust I had felt at the clinic now felt like a precursor to the cold, focused resolve that was finally taking over. I was done being the religious freak she mocked, the loser she laughed about, and the babysitter she relied on. I pulled out my phone, took high-resolution photos of every single statement, every deposit slip, and every wire transfer, and then pushed the broken cabinet drawer shut. I walked out of that house, the evidence of her lifelong betrayal secured in my cloud storage, and I didn't look back. I wasn't just a man who had been cheated on, I was a man who had just unlocked the evidence that would win the war. The game of being the good husband was over. The game of survival had begun, and for the first time in years, I was the one holding the winning hand. I didn't know yet how I was going to navigate the legal battle or how I would eventually tell the kids, but as I pulled out of the driveway, I knew one thing for certain. She was going to lose everything, and I was going to make sure she was the one who had to explain why. The next few days were a blur of cold, systematic precision. I was no longer the man who lived to provide for others. I was a man who lived to survive the wreckage of my own life. My attorney, a woman named Gina, was a bulldog. She didn't care about my heartache or my emotional state, she cared about the win. "Don't let her see you flinch," she told me on our first call, her voice clipped and professional. "She's built a life based on your trust. When you tear that down, don't leave a single brick standing. Get the kids, get the assets, and for God's sake, keep your mouth shut." Following her advice, I spent my time gathering documents and coordinating with a private investigator she recommended. I felt like a spy in my own home. I learned that my wife, Kayla, was meeting her lover, a man who worked at a local car dealership, during her so-called audit sessions. The Pi sent me photos of them at a local hotel, laughing and drinking, and for a moment, seeing those photos actually provided a strange, detached relief. It confirmed that the person I had been living with was not the woman I married. She was a complete stranger who had been wearing my wife's skin for years. But the hardest part wasn't the surveillance or the legal threats. It was the kids. Josh was 14, Carly 16, and they were caught in the middle of a war they didn't understand. I had to maintain some semblance of normalcy, cooking their favorite dinners and pretending to be interested in their school updates while inside I was screaming. I wanted to tell them everything, to force them to look at the photos, to make them understand why the world was ending. But I knew that would only destroy them. Kayla had already started painting me as the villain, telling them I was controlling and unhappy, and if I let my anger spill over, she would use that to turn them against me permanently. I took the children to my parents' house for the weekend, claiming we needed a family getaway while Kayla was away on a business trip. It was a painful lie. Sitting there with my parents, watching my kids eat pizza in the living room, I felt a deep, wrenching grief. They deserved a better life than this. They deserved a mother who didn't view them as props in her stage-managed suburban theater. While the kids were occupied, I drove back to the house to meet the Pi and finalize the evidence binder. We had everything: the financial statements proving the secret account, the time-stamped photos of her infidelity, and the records of her communications. It was a comprehensive map of a life built on betrayal. I was sitting at the kitchen table, finalizing the digital files when my phone rang. It was Carly. She sounded distant, her voice tight and guarded. "Dad, Mom called," she said, cutting right to the chase. "She told me you're making things really difficult for her and that you're being unreasonable about the house. She's really upset." I closed my eyes, taking a long, steady breath. I knew exactly what Kayla was doing. She was using the kids as human shields. "Carly," I said, keeping my tone as gentle as I could, "there are a lot of adult things happening right now that are very complicated. I'm doing my best to make sure you and Josh are safe and taken care of. I love you, and that's never going to change. But some things are not for you to worry about. Mom says you're the one who caused all this, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. She says you don't care about us. That was the moment the last of my mercy evaporated. Kayla wasn't just willing to hurt me, she was willing to weaponize our children's pain against me. Listen to me, I said, my voice steady, stripped of all warmth. Your mother has made choices. I have been faithful, hardworking, and dedicated to this family for 17 years. I am currently in the middle of cleaning up a mess that I didn't create, and I promise you, when all of this is over, you will understand exactly what happened. But for now, please don't believe everything you hear. And please just be safe. I hung up, my hands shaking again, but this time the shake wasn't from grief. It was from a cold, biting determination. She had tried to poison my relationship with my own daughter. She had tried to make my children believe that I was the monster. She had played the victim while she was the one looting our future, and now she was trying to play the martyr while she was in the middle of an affair. I sat back in the quiet, dark kitchen, the house around me feeling smaller and more fragile than ever. The evidence was all on my laptop, the photographs, the bank statements, the timeline of her double life. She had underestimated the very man she called a loser. She had assumed that I was the kind of person who would just lie down and take it, that I would be too scared of the social fallout or too insecure to face the truth. But she had been wrong. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the financials. I looked at the totals, the dates, the frequency of the deposits. Every single dollar was a piece of evidence. Every wire transfer was a confession. I wasn't just fighting for my marriage anymore, I was fighting for the truth, and I was going to make sure that the truth was exposed in a way that she couldn't spin, couldn't deny, and couldn't escape. The next morning, I met with Gina. She reviewed the new audio recording of Kayla and her affair partner, the one where they mocked me, and her eyes glinted. "This is it, Thomas," she said, sliding the binder back to me. "This isn't just about custody anymore. This is about leverage. She thinks she's in control. She thinks she has the moral high ground because she's the mother. But this is the end of the line for her. We serve the papers on Monday morning, we freeze the accounts, and we take control before she even has time to blink." I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of my mind, but it was now being outpaced by the clarity of the endgame. I was finally moving from the role of the victim to the role of the architect. My life had been sabotaged, yes, but I was currently engaged in the most vital project of my life, the total, irrevocable restoration of my own reality. And if Kayla wanted to play the game, I was finally ready to show her exactly how it was done. The legal storm that Gina and I were preparing was not something one could simply walk away from. We had all the pieces: the financial evidence, the photographic proof of infidelity, the audio recordings, and the documentation of my children's paternity. But there was a darker, more complex dimension to this process: the strategic, calculated dismantling of Kayla's world. It wasn't about spite. It was about ensuring that when we finally entered that courtroom, there would be no room for her to maneuver. By the following week, Gina had filed for an emergency temporary restraining order on the hidden account and had served the initial divorce filings. The atmosphere in our house had become unbearable. I had returned to live there temporarily under the advice of my lawyer, maintaining a stoic, detached silence that seemed to unsettle Kayla more than any shouting match could have. She would try to start arguments, accusing me of being distant or difficult, attempting to bait me into a reaction that she could record or use against me. I simply retreated to the guest room, focused on my work, and communicated only the bare minimum regarding the children's schedules. The psychological warfare was intense. She knew something was shifting. She would try to reestablish the dynamic of our old life, making passive-aggressive comments about how unhappy I was or how I was ruining the family vibe. I kept my eyes on the goal, refusing to be drawn into her version of reality. I wasn't just a husband who had been wronged. I was a partner who had been systematically exploited. During this time, I also had to grapple with the reality of my relationship with Josh and Carly. They were caught in the middle, and I knew that if I didn't frame this correctly, I would lose them. I started scheduling regular one-on-one time with them, away from the tension of the house. We would go for hikes or grab dinner at a neutral spot where I would simply listen to them. I didn't want to talk about their mother. I wanted to build a bridge of trust that existed independently of the wreckage happening under our roof. It was during one of these outings with Carly that I saw the first genuine crack in Kayla's influence. She had been asking about the weird tension in the house, and I finally decided to give her a small, controlled truth. "Carly," I said, choosing my words with agonizing care, "there are things happening between your mother and me that have nothing to do with you. I promise you that my love for you and Josh has never changed. But when adults make choices that hurt their family, those choices have consequences. I am not the one who changed. I am the one who is trying to keep this family afloat in a storm I didn't create." She looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of genuine curiosity in her eyes. It was the first sign that I was winning them back. The weekend before the papers were to be formally served, I received a notification from my bank. Kayla had attempted to access the frozen account, the one I had already successfully petitioned to have restricted, and it had triggered a fraud alert. She called me, her voice shrill with a mixture of panic and feigned confusion. "Thomas, what did you do? The bank said my accounts are locked. I can't pay the utilities, I can't access my own funds." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, listening to her perform the role of the victim one last time. "I didn't do anything, Kayla," I said, my voice as calm as a summer lake. "You'll have to talk to the bank about that. I'm sure they have their reasons." I hung up before she could start the screaming. That moment, standing in my living room watching the sunset through the window, was the first time I felt a true, absolute sense of power. She was panicking, her carefully constructed world of secrets and lies beginning to unravel, while I was simply waiting for the inevitable. The Monday morning I had been waiting for finally arrived. Gina met me outside the courthouse, her briefcase in hand, looking as sharp and focused as ever. We walked into the grand, imposing building, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and stressed-out people. This was where the reality of our marriage, the 17 years, the house, the children, the lies, would be dissected and adjudicated. As we waited for the judge to call our case, I watched Kayla across the room. She was talking to her attorney, gesturing wildly, her face a mask of indignation and manufactured distress. She still thought she was going to win. She still thought she could use her status as a mother and her polished persona to twist the situation back into her favor. I leaned over to Gina. "Are we ready?" "More than ready," she said, tapping the binders. She's going to walk in here thinking this is just another negotiation. She has no idea what's in this binder. She has no idea that the audio recordings, the financial records, and the PI reports are going to dismantle her entire case in 20 minutes. "Thomas, today isn't just about winning. Today is about making sure she never, ever has the power to manipulate this family again." I sat back watching the clock on the wall tick down. The judge called our names and we stood up, walking toward the bench together. I looked at the judge, a stern, older man who didn't look like he had much patience for nonsense. I felt a surge of calm. The chaos of the last few months, the burning pain of the diagnosis, the cold realization of the betrayal, all of it had led to this. I was no longer the victim of her narrative. I was the architect of my own truth, and I was ready to see it written into the record. This was the end of the audition. The real life, the life where I was an equal, a respected parent, and a man of integrity, was waiting on the other side of these doors. And as I stepped forward to face the judge, I knew that no matter what happened next, I was finally truly free. The atmosphere in the courtroom on that Monday morning was oppressive, a heavy, sterile silence that felt like the intake of breath before a massive storm. Gina was at her absolute best, her movements precise and her demeanor as sharp as a scalpel. She didn't need to shout or perform, she simply set the stage, one piece of irrefutable evidence after another. I sat at the defense table, watching Kayla, or Sarah, as I now thought of her, across the aisle. She had walked in wearing an expensive, tailored suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her face a mask of practiced indignation and manufactured distress. She still thought she was going to win. She still thought she could use her status as a mother and her polished persona to twist the situation back into her favor. She had spent 17 years playing this game, and she genuinely believed the jury would see her as the wronged, misunderstood wife fighting against a difficult husband. When the judge called for the first round of evidence, Gina didn't hesitate. She submitted the bank statements, the meticulously documented proof of the secret account where Kayla had been siphoning off nearly $1 million over 8 years. The look on Kayla's face when the judge allowed the entry of those financial records was priceless. Her expression shifted from indignant to frantic, her eyes scanning her own lawyers as if they could magically erase the paper trail she had so carelessly ignored. Then came the audio. The courtroom clerk fumbled with the equipment, the silence in the room thickening, and then the familiar, bright, mocking voice of my wife filled the chamber. It was crisp, clear, and utterly damning. "Oh, please," her voice echoed, jarringly cheerful and cold. "Mark is such a loser. Did you know he was a virgin when I met him? He's a total religious freak, but he's safe and he's basically a free babysitter. I'm just using him until the girls graduate high school and go off to college. Once I don't have to deal with custody, I'm taking my money and I'm out of there." The room erupted into a low murmur, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. I looked over at Kayla. Her face had gone completely deathly gray. She was physically shrinking in her seat, hunched over, desperately trying to disappear. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I had expected. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I just felt a profound, exhausting sadness for the version of myself that had spent 17 years trying so hard to be the good husband she was actively, cruelly mocking. When she took the stand, her performance was laughable. Her lawyers had coached her to lean into the trauma survivor narrative, trying to frame the accident and her subsequent coma as a reason for her behavior, as if her recklessness were some kind of unfortunate singular lapse in judgment. She tried to cry, she tried to claim she was suffering from a temporary mental break, and she insisted that the affair was just a moment of weakness spurred by the stress of her high-pressure career. But then Gina began her cross-examination. She didn't play nice. She brought up the 3 different men she had visited in that single, frantic afternoon just hours before her car accident. She brought up the timeline of the bank accounts, showing exactly how long she had been planning to leave me. "Is it also a sign of a mental break, Mrs. Watson?" Gina asked, her voice sharp as a razor, "to secretly open a high-yield account with a different bank and transfer over $900,000, all while telling your husband that money was tight?" Kayla couldn't answer. She started stuttering, backpedaling, and eventually dissolved into a mess of incoherent sobs. It was the undoing of a facade she had carefully maintained for nearly 2 decades. The jury wasn't seeing a victim of stress. They were seeing a predator who had leveraged her family's trust to facilitate a secret, ego-driven life. Then there was the testimony from her own sister, Loretta. I had been terrified that Loretta would cave to familial pressure or refuse to speak out against her own flesh and blood. But when she walked onto the stand, she was colder than any prosecutor I could have imagined. She didn't hold back. She told the court about how Kayla had treated our parents, how she had manipulated her own blood family, and how she had essentially dehumanized me from the day we were married. She looked at Kayla one last time, turned away, and walked off the stand without a single backward glance. It was the final nail in the coffin of her defense. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, it was swift and absolute. Full custody to me. The financial settlement was a complete lopsided victory. My half of the secret $1 million was returned, all legal fees were covered by her, and the visitation rights were heavily restricted, with the judge citing her clear pattern of manipulation and lack of regard for the well-being of her children. I leaned over to Gina. "Are we ready?" "More than ready," she said, tapping the binder. "She's going to walk in here thinking this is just another negotiation. She has no idea what's in this binder. She has no idea that the audio recordings, the financial records, and the PI reports are going to dismantle her entire case in 20 minutes. Mark, today isn't just about winning. Today is about making sure she never, ever has the power to manipulate this family again." I sat back, watching the clock on the wall tick down. The judge called our names and we stood up, walking toward the bench together. I looked at the judge, a stern older man who didn't look like he had much patience for nonsense. I felt a surge of calm. The chaos of the last few months, the burning pain of the diagnosis, the cold realization of the betrayal, all of it had led to this. I was no longer the victim of her narrative. I was the architect of my own truth, and I was ready to see it written into the record. This was the end of the audition. The real life, the life where I was an equal, a respected parent, and a man of integrity, was waiting on the other side of these doors. And as I stepped forward to face the judge, I knew that no matter what happened next, I was finally truly free. The life I had been living was a fiction, but the future I was about to walk into was built on the solid ground of the truth. I had stripped away the false persona, I had held the mirror up to her lies, and I was ready to leave the wreckage behind. I took a deep breath, looked at my daughters, and stepped into the rest of my life. The days immediately following the trial felt less like a celebration and more like a long, slow exhale after holding my breath for nearly 2 decades. The courtroom had been the site of the final severance, but the true battle was the quiet, day-to-day work of rebuilding a foundation that had been eroded by years of systematic deception. I returned to a house that finally felt like it belonged to me, not to a woman who had treated our home as a stage set for a performance I was never invited to watch. Stripping the house of Kayla's touch was the first step in reclaiming my environment. It was an oddly cathartic process. I spent days removing the cold, impersonal decor she had curated, the designer accents that were meant to impress her real estate and accounting clients, the overly sterile aesthetic that had made our family home feel like a display model in an upscale catalog. I replaced the staged furniture with pieces that were actually comfortable, items I had wanted for years but had been talked out of because they didn't fit the image. Every box I packed up and sent to donation felt like a physical weight lifting from my shoulders. I was curating a home that was entirely mine, a space that didn't require an audition or a performance. Josh and Carly, my teenagers, were the silent casualties of the preceding months, but they were also the most resilient. They had been forced to navigate the chaos of their mother's choices and the sudden, jarring reality of our family's dissolution, but they emerged with a maturity that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. They no longer felt the need to perform perfection to earn their mother's conditional affection. We established new traditions: slow Saturday mornings filled with pancakes and the honest, unfiltered smell of coffee, long drives to state parks just to wander through the trees, and open, unfiltered conversations that were never meant to be edited. I made it my primary mission to prioritize their mental health, enrolling them in therapy to help them process the abandonment and the betrayal. We tackled the anger together, acknowledging the pain rather than hiding it under a veneer of suburban normalcy. We were building a new foundation, not on the grand illusions Kayla had constructed, but on the simple, boring, beautiful truth of being a family that loved each other for who we were, not for what we could provide. During this period, I found myself thinking a lot about the role I had allowed myself to play. For 17 years, I had accepted the role of the provider, the good husband, the one who kept the home running so she could have the freedom to live her own life. I had accepted the label of the boring engineer while she painted herself as the high-achieving professional. I had allowed her to define me, to box me into a persona that was safe, manageable, and useful. But as the silence of the bungalow settled in, I realized that the greatest betrayal wasn't what she had taken, the time, the money, the trust. It was what I had given away, my own sense of self. I had auditioned for my place in her life, and when the curtain finally fell, I realized the show was a tragedy, not the romance I had believed it to be. It was during this time of reflection that I began to reconnect with Rhonda. She was a widow from our community, a woman who had also walked through the fires of loss and come out the other side with her dignity intact. We had known each other in passing for years, but in the quiet of my new life, we actually saw each other. Our dates were simple, unpretentious affairs, dinners where we actually listened to one another, movies where we didn't have to analyze subtext, and long, easy talks about everything and nothing. Rhonda didn't want the life I had curated for show. She wanted to know the man who had survived it. She didn't want me to be a provider, a babysitter, or a religious freak. She just wanted me to be Thomas. For the first time in 17 years, I wasn't an auditioning actor in my own home. I was just a person, and that realization was almost dizzying in its simplicity. I realized that my previous marriage had forced me to be someone I wasn't, someone who lived in constant fear of being not enough. But with Rhonda, I could finally just be me. Of course, the past still had a way of intruding. I'd be walking through the grocery store and see someone who had a similar stride to Kayla's, or I'd hear a turn of phrase that she used to employ, and I'd feel a momentary, sharp spike of anxiety in my chest. But the spike would pass. It didn't define me anymore. I learned to trust my instincts. When I met someone new, I no longer automatically assumed they were kind. I watched, I waited, and I set firm boundaries. I realized that setting a boundary is not an act of hostility, it is the physical expression of self-respect. You are allowed to have edges. You are allowed to stop pouring your energy, your time, and your resources into people who treat you like a line item on a ledger. The money, that nearly $1 million I had recovered from the secret account, was the final piece of the puzzle. I had successfully managed to lock almost every penny of it into a secure, irrevocable trust fund for Josh and Carly's future. The bank had been surprisingly cooperative once the court documents were finalized, and their liability became clear. It was a strange, powerful feeling to look at that account balance. It wasn't mine to spend, and it certainly wasn't Kayla's to steal. It was a reparations payment for the childhood and the security she had tried to shortchange. As I look back on everything now, I realize the money was the least significant part of the journey. The truth was the real prize. The truth had set me free from the crushing, exhausting weight of being manipulated, used, and lied to. I often think about the day at the clinic, the sheer horror of that diagnosis, the smell of the antiseptic, the look of disgust on the nurse's face, and how it acted as the catalyst that tore the mask off my life. It was a terrifying, humiliating medical crisis, yes, but it was also the ultimate gift of clarity. It forced me to look at my life not as it was presented to me, but as it actually was. If you are listening to this and you feel that you are being taken for granted, or if you suspect that the person you share your life with is living a double life at your expense, listen to your gut. Do not wait for a medical crisis or a catastrophic accident to open your eyes. You have every right to audit your own life, to demand transparency, and to fiercely protect the assets you have worked your entire life to build. Generosity is not a weakness, but it should never be a blank check for exploitation. My name is Thomas Miller. I am a father, a protector, and a man who finally learned that the most important relationship you will ever maintain is the one you have with your own integrity. I closed the door on that darkest chapter of my life, turned the key, and threw it away. And for the first time in 17 years, I am finally living for myself and for the people who truly love me back. My past is a lesson, not a sentence, and I am finally free. I don't know what the next 17 years will look like, but for the first time, not knowing doesn't scare me. It feels like an invitation. I have my children, I have my peace, and I have the clarity that only the truth can provide. And that is a victory that nobody can ever take back. The courtroom was air-conditioned to an icy temperature, but the heat in the room was palpable as the final day of the proceedings arrived. I sat at the mahogany table, my posture rigid, flanked by my two teenage children, Josh and Carly. They were silent, their eyes downcast, navigating the wreckage of a life they once thought was unbreakable. Across the aisle sat Kayla, her expression a fragile mask of practiced sorrow. She looked smaller than I remembered, her tailored suit appearing a size too big, as if the reality of the situation was physically consuming her. Gina, my attorney, walked toward the jury box with the steady, predatory grace of a professional who has already won. She didn't need to perform, she only needed to present the truth. She had already walked them through the financial records, the years of calculated siphoning, the secret, untraceable million-dollar account, and the brazen way Kayla had used our joint resources to fund her double life. But today, Gina was going to land the final, devastating blow. She turned to the judge and requested to play the final piece of evidence, a collection of recordings from the last few weeks of our marriage, captured by the private investigator. The courtroom clerk fumbled with the digital file, the low hum of the air conditioner the only sound in the room. Then Kayla's voice filled the chamber, clear, bright, and utterly cruel. She was talking to the man she'd been seeing, laughing as she described her daily routine. "Oh, please," her voice crackled over the speakers, jarring in its familiarity. "Thomas is such a loser. Did you know he was a virgin when I met him? He's a total religious freak, but he's safe and he's basically a free babysitter. I'm just using him until the girls graduate high school and go off to college. Once I don't have to deal with custody, I'm taking my money and I'm out of there." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of her inhumanity. I looked over at Kayla. The mask had finally crumbled. She was gray-faced, shaking, her hands gripped tightly in her lap. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was a woman whose soul had been laid bare in the most clinical, unflattering light. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I had expected. I didn't feel a rush of vengeance. I just felt a profound, exhausting sadness for the version of myself that had spent 17 years trying so hard to be the good husband that this woman was actively mocking. When Kayla took the stand, her performance was a masterclass in desperation. Her team tried to lean into the trauma survivor narrative, framing her recklessness as a temporary mental break from the pressures of her career. She tried to cry, she tried to claim she was suffering, and she insisted that the affair was just a moment of weakness. But then Gina began her cross-examination. She didn't play nice. She didn't play for sympathy. She just played for the truth. She brought up the 3 different men Kayla had visited in that single, frantic afternoon just hours before her car accident. She brought up the specific timeline of the bank accounts, demonstrating exactly how many years she had been meticulously planning to discard our family. "Is it also a sign of a mental break, Mrs. Miller?" Gina asked, her voice sharp as a razor. "To secretly open a high-yield account with a different bank and transfer over $900,000, all while telling your husband that money was tight and that you needed to work longer hours to keep the house." Kayla couldn't answer. She started stuttering, backpedaling, and eventually dissolved into a mess of incoherent sobs. It was the undoing of a facade she had carefully maintained for nearly 2 decades. The jury wasn't seeing a victim of stress. They were seeing a calculated predator who had leveraged her family's trust to facilitate a secret, ego-driven life. The most damning moment came when Loretta, Kayla's own sister, was called to testify. I had been terrified that Loretta would buckle under familial pressure, but when she stepped up to the stand, she was colder than any prosecutor I could have imagined. She looked at Kayla, then at the judge, and she laid it out. She told the court about how Kayla had treated our parents, how she had manipulated her own blood family, and how she had essentially dehumanized me from the day we were married. She described the arrogance, the greed, and the way Kayla had bragged about her exit strategy to anyone who would listen. It was the final nail in the coffin. She didn't look back at her sister once. The verdict was swift and absolute, full custody to me. The financial settlement was a complete lopsided victory. My half of the secret $1 million was returned, all legal fees were covered by her, and her visitation rights were heavily restricted, with the judge citing her clear pattern of manipulation and lack of regard for the well-being of her children. As I walked out of the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt foreign, almost blinding. Josh and Carly walked on either side of me, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder or wonder what new lie was being spun. My children took my hands, their grips firm and reassuring. They didn't have to say a word. I could see the change in their posture. The tension that had been weighing them down for months was finally beginning to lift. The months that followed were a long, slow exhale. The money was put directly into secured college trust funds for the kids. I didn't want a dime of it for myself. I sold our old house, the house that felt haunted by her fake persona and her secret life, and bought a smaller, simpler place that was finally truly ours. We established a quiet, peaceful routine. We had movie nights where we didn't have to worry about who was calling or where someone was going. We had dinner without the underlying anxiety of walking on eggshells. I finally felt like I could breathe. I started going to the gym, I reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with, and I started actually enjoying my life again. I realized that my previous marriage had forced me to be someone I wasn't, someone who lived in constant fear of being not enough. With Rhonda, the woman I started dating later, I could finally just be me. As I look back on everything, I realized the money was the least significant part of the journey. The nearly $500,000 secured my children's future, but the real prize was the truth. The truth had set me free from the crushing weight of being manipulated, used, and lied to. I often think about the day at the clinic, the sheer horror of that diagnosis, and how it acted as the catalyst that tore the mask off my life. It was a terrifying, humiliating medical crisis, yes, but it was also the ultimate gift of clarity. It forced me to look at my life not as it was presented to me, but as it actually was. If you are listening to this and you feel that you are being taken for granted, or if you suspect that the person you share your life with is living a double life at your expense, listen to your gut. Do not wait for a medical crisis or a catastrophic accident to open your eyes. You have every right to audit your own life, to demand transparency, and to fiercely protect the assets you have worked your entire life to build. Generosity is not a weakness, but it should never be a blank check for exploitation. My name is Thomas Miller. I am a father, a protector, and a man who finally learned that the most important relationship you will ever maintain is the one you have with your own integrity. I closed the door on that darkest chapter of my life, turned the key, and threw it away. And for the first time in 17 years, I am finally living for myself and for the people who truly love me back. My past is a lesson, not a sentence, and I am finally free. The final judgment hadn't just been a legal formality. It was the ultimate cold-blooded severance of a life that had been built on a foundation of shifting sand. The courtroom had cleared, but the echo of the judge's ruling, the finality of full custody, the freezing of the ill-gotten assets, and the absolute destruction of Kayla's carefully maintained facade, continued to reverberate in the weeks that followed. The victory, as profound as it was, wasn't something I ran home to shout from the rooftops. It was something I carried with me as I walked into a quiet house that finally felt like my own. I had spent nearly 2 decades auditioning for a role I never truly wanted, and now the house was mine to define. The first few weeks of living on my own in the new bungalow were a masterclass in shedding skin. I wasn't just clearing out furniture. I was clearing out the habits of a man who had lived in a constant state of apprehension. I replaced her designer staging pieces with furniture that prioritized comfort and function, and I found a deep, meditative peace in the simple act of living without an audience. The house was no longer a stage set, it was a sanctuary. Josh and Carly, my children, were the primary beneficiaries of this newfound quiet. They had been tossed into the epicenter of the divorce, navigating the collapse of the only life they had ever known, but they had responded with a maturity that frequently surprised me. They had seen the true face of the woman who had shared our home, and they had processed it in their own ways. I didn't push them to talk or force them to act okay. I just made sure the space around them was safe. We established our own rhythm, pancake-heavy Saturdays, long, aimless drives in the countryside, and real conversations. We didn't talk about Kayla. We talked about school, about their hopes for the future, and about the small, mundane joys that I had completely overlooked for years. In those months of recovery, I began to see Rhonda for who she truly was. Our relationship grew in the soil of our shared honesty, free from the performative expectations that had defined my marriage. We were friends first, and that foundation made the romance feel less like a dramatic affair and more like coming home after a long, exhausting journey. She didn't want the version of me that was a provider or a babysitter. She wanted the man who had survived the rubble. Our life together was simple, unpretentious, and consistently kind. It was the first time in 17 years that I wasn't auditioning to be loved. I was just being loved for existing. There were, of course, the inevitable ghosts of the past. I would occasionally find a stray receipt, hear a specific phrase, or encounter someone who would trigger a flash of panic or a spike in blood pressure. I would be walking through a store or driving to work, and I'd feel the old, suffocating anxiety begin to constrict my chest. But the difference now was that the spike didn't define the rest of my day. I had learned the art of observation. I recognized the trigger, acknowledged the memory, and moved on. I had learned to trust my instincts above everything else. Setting boundaries, I found, was not an act of malice. It was an act of profound self-respect. You are allowed to have edges. You are allowed to stop pouring your energy, your time, and your resources into people who treat you as a mere convenience or a line item in their ledger. The nearly $1 million, the secret treasure Kayla had spent 8 years stealing, had been successfully locked away in a secure, irrevocable trust fund for Josh and Carly's future college education. The bank had been surprisingly cooperative once the court documents were finalized and their liability became clear. It was a strange, powerful feeling to look at that account balance on a quarterly statement. It wasn't mine to spend, and it certainly wasn't Kayla's to steal. It was a reparations payment for the childhood and the security she had tried to shortchange. As I look back on everything now, I realize the money was the least significant part of the journey. The truth was the real prize. The truth had set me free from the crushing, exhausting weight of being manipulated, used, and lied to. I often think about the day at the clinic, the sheer horror of that diagnosis, the smell of the antiseptic, the look of disgust on the nurse's face, and how it acted as the catalyst that tore the mask off my life. It was a terrifying, humiliating medical crisis, yes, but it was also the ultimate gift of clarity. It forced me to look at my life not as it was presented to me, but as it actually was. If you are listening to this and you feel that you are being taken for granted, or if you suspect that the person you share your life with is living a double life at your expense, listen to your gut. Do not wait for a medical crisis or a catastrophic accident to open your eyes. You have every right to audit your own life, to demand transparency, and to fiercely protect the assets you have worked your entire life to build. Generosity is not a weakness, but it should never be a blank check for exploitation. My name is Thomas Miller. I am a father, a protector, and a man who finally learned that the most important relationship you will ever maintain is the one you have with your own integrity. I closed the door on that darkest chapter of my life, turned the key, and threw it away. And for the first time in 17 years, I am finally living for myself and for the people who truly love me back. My past is a lesson, not a sentence, and I am finally free. The story doesn't end with a grand, cinematic revenge plot or a dramatic, slow-motion explosion of her life. It ends in a quiet, modest bungalow on the edge of town, with a daughter who is beginning to look at me with pride again, a son who is learning what it means to be a man, and a life that is built on the bedrock of genuine, unshakable truth. I have no idea what the next 17 years will look like, if I'll move, if I'll marry again, if I'll change my path entirely. But for the first time, not knowing doesn't scare me. It feels like an invitation. I didn't get here by being quiet, and I didn't get here by being a martyr. I got here by standing up for the one thing that no one, not even a person as skilled at lying as Kayla, could ever take away from me, my own reality. And that is a victory that nobody can ever take back. I wake up every morning, I make my coffee, and I start a day that belongs entirely to me. That is freedom. And it is worth more than every commission, every bonus, and every single cent she ever stole. The courtroom proceedings had finally concluded, but for me the true work was just beginning. It was not a grand, cinematic revenge plot or a dramatic, slow-motion explosion of Kayla's life. That kind of thing only happens in movies. The reality of my victory was far more quiet, yet infinitely more satisfying. It ended in a modest, sun-drenched bungalow on the edge of town, a place that felt small but secure, where I was finally the master of my own domain. I had reclaimed my life from the debris, and for the first time in 17 years, I was no longer an actor playing a scripted role. My daughter Carly was the first to bridge the gap. After months of silence and the toxicity that Kayla had tried to pour into her ears, the truth had finally started to sink in. She had seen her mother's reality laid bare in a court of law, and the shock had given way to a painful, necessary maturity. One afternoon, while I was tending to the small garden I'd started in the backyard, a hobby that felt like a deliberate reclaiming of my time, I heard the screen door creak. It was Carly holding 2 mugs of tea. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said, her voice small, the brittle defiance that had characterized her teenage years replaced by something genuine. I didn't understand. I believed her because I wanted to believe that the world made sense, and I wanted to believe that our family was normal. I didn't want to see the things you were seeing. I put down my trowel and stood up, the damp earth still clinging to my gloves. I looked at her, and for the first time in months, I didn't see the version of my daughter that had been weaponized against me. I saw a young woman who was also, in her own way, a survivor. "You were a kid, Carly," I said, my voice steady. "You weren't supposed to understand the complexities of what was happening. You were supposed to be safe. My job was to protect you, even when you didn't know you needed protection and even when you were fighting me. I'm just glad you're here now." That conversation, simple as it was, acted as the final seal on the wreckage. Josh, my son, joined us soon after, and while our dynamic was different, he was quieter, more observant. His presence was a testament to the stability we were finally building. We weren't a perfect family. We were a family that had been broken, dismantled, and carefully reassembled, like a machine that had been taken apart and cleaned of all its rust. The quiet of the bungalow, which had once felt like a strange new environment, became the foundation of our daily life. I didn't know what the next 17 years would look like. I didn't know if I would ever marry again, if I'd move to a new city, or if I'd change my professional path entirely. And for the first time in my life, that ambiguity didn't scare me. It felt like an invitation. I had my children, I had my peace, and I had the clarity that only the truth can provide. I hadn't gotten to this point by being quiet, and I certainly hadn't gotten here by being a martyr. I had reached this place of relative stillness by standing up for the one thing that no one, not even a person as skilled at deception as Kayla, could ever take away from me, my own reality. And that is a victory that nobody could ever take back from me. Every morning I wake up, I make my own coffee, and I start a day that belongs entirely to me. That is freedom. And it is worth more than every commission, every quarterly bonus, and every single cent she ever stole. As I watched my children walk toward their own futures, Carly graduating, Josh finding his own path, I realized that the lesson I had been forced to learn was not about how to survive, but about how to recognize my own worth. For years, I had believed that love was something you had to earn, something you had to audition for, and something that required a certain level of performance. I had been wrong. Love, true love, doesn't require a resume or a performance review. It requires transparency, shared values, and the kind of quiet, steady respect that Kayla had treated as a disposable, optional luxury. My past was a lesson, not a sentence, and I was finally free. The weight of the financial betrayal, once an agonizing, suffocating burden, was now just a chapter in a book I had finished writing. The trust fund I had established for the kids had grown, and seeing it sit there, untouched and secure, was a reminder that even when things are at their darkest, there is a path to a more honorable life. I had no desire to track Kayla's life after the divorce. I didn't want to know if she was struggling, if she was thriving, or if she was still playing the same games with a different audience. Her reality was her own, and it had no place in the world I had built for myself. I've begun to teach Josh how to manage his own accounts, how to recognize the signs of financial responsibility and integrity. We spend hours in the garage, tinkering with old engines or fixing things around the bungalow, and those hours are the most valuable currency I've ever possessed. They are the moments that Kayla never made time for because they didn't align with her schedule of personal advancement. And in those moments, I know I've won. If you are listening to this and you feel that you are being taken for granted, or if you suspect that the person you share your life with is living a double life at your expense, listen to your gut. Do not wait for a medical crisis or a catastrophic accident to open your eyes. You have every right to audit your own life, to demand transparency, and to fiercely protect the assets you have worked your entire life to build. Generosity is not a weakness, but it should never be a blank check for exploitation. My name is Thomas Miller. I am a father, a protector, and a man who finally learned that the most important relationship you will ever maintain is the one you have with your own integrity. I closed the door on that darkest chapter of my life, turned the key, and threw it away. I didn't walk through the world looking for revenge. I walked through the world looking for peace. And that, I've found, is the ultimate form of retribution. To wake up and know with absolute certainty that no one is pulling the strings of your existence, that you are and always will be the sole author of your own history that is worth more than all the gold, all the properties, and all the false performative approval in the world. I am finally free, and for the first time in my life I am happy. The storm has passed, the sun has come up, and I am standing on the solid ground of my own making, ready for whatever happens next. The journey from the wreckage of my marriage to the peace I currently enjoy did not happen overnight. It was a process of deliberate reconstruction, brick by brick. After the trial, when the final gavel fell and the financial settlements were executed, I didn't feel the need to chase down Kayla or her accomplice, Clarence. Many people, friends, colleagues, even distant relatives, asked me why I didn't push for more, or why I didn't try to ruin them in ways that would have left me just as broken as they were. The reality was simple. I couldn't hurt them without risking my own freedom, and I certainly couldn't let their toxic influence dictate my future any longer. I decided to move forward and live my life as best I could. They say the best revenge is a life well lived, and that is precisely what I did. I let karma deal with the rest. Clarence and Kayla didn't suffer some cinematic downfall, but they didn't walk away unscathed either. Their lives shifted into a smaller, lonelier orbit, while I found my way back to the people who truly mattered. I have my children back in my life, a relationship that is now built on the solid ground of honesty rather than the fragile pretense of the past. Being surrounded by people who love me unconditionally has been the greatest reward I could have ever hoped for. Recently, I experienced one of the most significant honors a father can have. My daughter, Carly, got married. As I stood in the back of the church adjusting my tie, I felt a familiar, sharp pang of nostalgia for the man I was before the worst Monday of my life. My daughter walked over to me, her eyes bright, and asked, "Are you ready, Daddy?" I know no father is ever truly willing to let his daughter go, but I felt honored to walk her down that aisle. I replied, "I am more than ready." The doors opened, music filled the church, and I proudly led her toward her future. My wife, Rhonda, the woman who stood by me through the rebuilding, took her place of honor in the front row and smiled broadly. It was a beautiful, clear, and unburdened moment. I had taken care of that last, important honor for my daughter, and as Carly told me, she was doing it right the first time. Light bulb, a valuable lesson for the listener. If you take only one thing away from my story, let it be this: your integrity is the only thing that cannot be stolen from you. For years, I believed that love was something I had to audition for, something I had to earn through constant performance and self-sacrifice. I was wrong. True love, whether from a partner, your children, or yourself, does not require you to sacrifice your reality or your sense of self. Generosity is not a weakness, but it should never be a blank check for exploitation. If you suspect that you are being taken for granted or that someone you trust is living a double life at your expense, do not wait for a catastrophic event to open your eyes. You have every right to audit your own life, to demand transparency, and to fiercely protect the assets and the peace you have worked your entire life to build. You do not need to seek revenge to win. The most profound form of retribution is to walk away, close the door, and build a life so full of genuine happiness and integrity that the people who tried to destroy you become irrelevant footnotes in your story. You are the sole author of your own history. Don't let anyone else hold the pen.